This is the second part of a three-part series in doing a full Buckram library binding. Now this project, as I said last week, is based on Arthur Johnson's description of a library binding in full Buckram, and this week we will take the project up to having the boards attached. So we'll start by cleaning up the edge shoulders of the book. So last week we backed the book, put the shoulders on the book, but I didn't sharpen them up. So I'll use a bone folder and a board to sharpen the shoulders. So I'll pull the bone folder back towards me quite forcefully with the shoulders between the grey board and the bone folder, and they'll give a nice crisp edge to the shoulders, and we'll also take them back pretty much close to a 90-degree angle to the book. Now that the spine is in its final shape, I'll continue with the lining of the spine. The first layer will be a layer of scrim. Now in Johnson only lines the scrim from shoulder to shoulder. However, I'm going to put a piece of scrim down that extends past the shoulders, and this is following the instructions of K-A-Y, in the small book called Advanced Bookbinding, and I'll have the reference in the description. I like this design because it beefs up the tab that's inserted into the split boards, as that scrim is incorporated into the waste sheet. As always, I'm using PVA to glue up the spine. It's a strong and flexible adhesive, and then I'll work the scrim down really well over that PVA. Some of the PVA is going to seep through the scrim, and that's a good indication of a strong bond between the spine and the scrim. Use some baking paper as rubbing down paper to rub that down well. I'll grab the split boards out of the press at this point. We don't necessarily need them right now, but they're nice thick boards and they're useful for handling the book at this point. But the next step is to make the tab that will go into the split boards, and we'll start by trimming up the scrim to the head of the book, and then we'll trim it to the width that we'll want, which I think I use 35 millimeters, and then we'll trim the cotton tape supports to about the same width. I'm using 35mm to trim up the scrim because that's about 1/4 of the width of the book. And I'll cut the tapes off slightly shorter than the edge of the scrim. I'm looking to gradually reduce the thickness of the tab that's going to be inserted into the split board. Now to make the tab that's going to be inserted into the split board, I'll use the waste sheet. That'll get folded over the supports and the scrim. So I'll just make sure that it's well formed down into the shoulders. I'll use PVA for the adhesive. I'll put it under the tapes to start with, and then I'll glue out the half of the waste sheet that is towards the spine of the book, because I want to apply the adhesive to the side that is closest to the book, so if it does curl, it'll curl or pull in towards the book. I'll give this a quick nip in the press for 10-20 seconds with tins underneath the tab. If you don't have tins, then just your normal sheet of plastic will be fine as well. Just don't over nip it. You don't want to press that shape down into the end pages. But it's not you don't leave it in the press for hours or anything like that. It's just a quick nip to even up the adhesive and flatten out those tabs, and then put a moisture barrier and then blotting paper either side of the tabs, and then let that dry under a bit of light weight, such as a brick. Now, continuing with the spine lining, the next step is to flatten the spine a little bit. There's lumps where the cotton tape supports are, so I'll put sort of heavy craft paper in between the tapes. So I'll cut a strip of craft paper to the width of the spine and then cut that into lengths to fit between the tapes. And then I'll glue that down. I'll put a good layer of PVA over the whole spine at the same time. Hopefully at this point the spine is quite flat. If you've still got a lot of lumps and bumps, then you could put another layer of craft paper over the whole spine and sand that. But the more layers there are to the spine lining, the stiffer the book is to open. So you want to only just use enough. Now we'll put the hollow tube on the spine of the book. So we'll measure the width of the spine on the craft paper. Now this will be a 1 on 2 off hollow, and I'll make this one off the book and then glue it to the book. There's nothing particularly fancy about this step. One thing I should mention is both the first layer of craft paper and this hollow tube are longer than the book, so they should extend further than the boards, and then we'll trim these to the same heights as the boards. So having let it dry overnight, we'll move on to trimming the tab that's going to be inserted into the split boards to the final size. So I'm going out 40 millimeters here, and so it's a little bit further than where the scrim was, so that I'm gradually reducing the thickness of the tab. And then I'll also trim an inch off at the head and tail of the tab, and that's to facilitate doing the turn-ins when we cover the book. If we don't do this, then we can't turn the buckram down over the boards. When trimming the pieces off at the head and the tail, be careful not to cut into the shoulder of the book, but also you don't want to leave any excess material hanging off the shoulder of the book, which will show through the buckram later. I'll also just trim off the corners of the tab just to make it easier to insert into the split boards later. In preparation for attaching the split boards, we'll trim the boards to size. I'll start by straightening the edge with the split in it, that's where the tab's going to be inserted, and then I will true up one end at a right angle using my bench hook, and then I'll cut the boards to height. So I'll measure the height of the text block. I'll do 3mm squares at the head and tail. So once I've got the height of the book, I'll add 6mm to get the height of the boards. If you've seen my previous video, you'll remember that I used 4mm knitting needles to make the groove between the shoulders and the boards. And so I've made a 5mm spacer that gives a bit of extra space for the cloth that'll go down into the groove. And I will position the boards using that spacer. Now the shoulders at this point aren't perfectly vertical, and I'm measuring that 5mm from the top of the shoulders to the edge of the board. Now I'll put registration marks on the boards so it'll be easy to position them once I've put adhesive in the splits. When gluing up split boards, you want to make sure that you've got everything that you need organised and ready and at easy reach. Don't want to be mucking around with things when you're trying to attach the split boards. As soon as they're attached, I'm going to give them a good press with the tins underneath the boards. Now you want to put enough adhesive to make sure that the boards don't delaminate later, but it's also an easy thing to do to have the adhesive pool at the bottom of the opening, so you just want to try and avoid that because that'll squeeze out later and make a mess. Once you've put the split boards on the book, you've got a small period of time when you can position it. So don't squeeze the boards closed straight away. Just check the squares are correct, head and tail, and that the registration marks are lined up. And then apply some pressure at the head and tail of the boards, and that will key the boards together and they won't move after that. Having used PVA to attach the boards, the book doesn't have to stay in the press a long time. I would say an hour at a minimum would be a good idea, but you probably get away with as little as 15 minutes as well. So the next step is to trim up the spine linings to the same height as the boards. I'll use a piece of scrap paper to wrap around the book to transfer the board heights to the spine, and then I'll use scissors to trim that up. The final step I'll do today is to trim up the boards at the foredge. So I'll mark a 3mm square, or if you like a slightly wider foredge square, then you could go 4mm, though that's a little bit on the large side. Traditionally, the square's 1.5 times the thickness of the boards, and these boards are 3mm. So 4mm, I guess, isn't outrageous, but I think I did go with 3mm squares. That's enough for this week. Next week we'll finish the book by doing the covering. We'll use universal or library corners, which is a bit different. I've got a video that shows those corners in cloth, but I've never used them in a video before, so that's a little bit of fun. If you've enjoyed this week's video, as always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. And if you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. I hope everyone's well and taking care of themselves. And until next time, cheerio.